In a couple minutes, I'll talk about how you can get your questions and answers, how you can send those questions and answers in for us. As Dr. Randolph mentioned a moment ago, for those of you that heard it, this session is being recorded. So again, welcome to the session. We've got a general session planned for the first couple hours from 1300 to 1500. What we're going to do is we're going to work through all the presentations first, and then there'll be some time for some questions and answers. Following that, we'll also be around. The presenters will remain where they are, either here in Rice Hall or virtually, and we'll have another hour. So we will stay here another hour for you to answer additional questions. After the presentation, the recorded transcript and some other additional materials will be available. So the purpose of today's training is to really talk about the process that a PI goes through from basically cradle to grave, from application all the way to award. And what we want to highlight for you today are some new regulations, new policies, new procedures, some new guidance that's coming out for our principal investigators. A lot has changed in the last year or two, so even if you're an experienced PI, I think you're going to get a lot out of the training today. We've got a great program, and we've got some truly excellent providers, so I hope you enjoy this session today. Next slide, please. PI responsibilities. You're it, basically. As the PI, you are responsible for everything that happens, again, cradle to grave.
Excuse me, Miss.
The slides are not being presented.
No slides are shown.
All right, just a moment, please, for those of you online. We're resetting the slides to make sure you can access them. Okay, all right. So as I was just mentioning, the PI has the ultimate responsibility for this process, and that's why you're here today. And again, thank you all for being here. Next slide. Now, I mentioned we will have a question and answer session following the presentations. In order to communicate your questions to us, what you can do is in the upper right portion of your screen, you'll see a little cluster of geometric icons, a circle, a square, and a triangle. If you click on that, what's going to open up is a little menu where there will be a choice between polling and Q&A. We're not going to use the polling, but if you select the Q&A, as in number 2 there, you'll see a space where you can type in your question. As you're typing in your question, or as you're opening this menu up and seeing what other principal investigators are posting as their question, you have the opportunity, if someone else has already mostly or typed your exact question, you can just click the little thumbs up sign to like that question. And again, what we're going to try to do, I'd like for us to get through all your questions, but in case we can't, the questions that have the most, that they're from most of the PIs are the ones that we will try to answer first. All right, so with that, next slide, please. So I'd like to now introduce Dr. Toya Randolph, a woman who clearly needs no explanation because we all know her well. Welcome, Dr. Randolph.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Whitmire, and thank you to all of you who've joined us here today. Just a few VPR updates that I'd like to share with everyone. The first update, of course, this is a very special day for USU and for VPR, not only because we're having our first PI training and we're not, we did not plan this way, it just so happened to work out this way. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Mark Kortepeter to the university, returning to the university as the leader of the Office of the Vice President for Research. I would ask Dr. Kortepeter, if you don't mind, if you'd like to come say a word or two. You've got about 1 minute max. Thank you for coming.
Great, thank you, Dr. Randolph, and thank you all researchers out there. I do want to say, it's great to be back here. I retired in 2016, and so it's almost been 5 years. It's hard to believe that time has flown by so fast, but it's an honor and a pleasure to be back. And I first of all want to thank Dr. Toya Randolph for serving as the acting vice president for research for almost the last year. So I appreciate what she's done here, and appreciate the fact that we're going to try to work on a handoff here, and I'll be leveraging and learning from a lot of you, including Dr. Randolph. I want to say sort of my general philosophy, and I'll be walking around and really doing a lot of listening here in the near future. But really, my philosophy is I see USU as a key linchpin and a key foundation in Department of Defense research, as well as national research enterprise. And so I see our job here in the VPR shop as to facilitate and champion the work you're doing. So if we're not doing that, I want to hear about it. And really, we're here to support you. So I appreciate, once again, the opportunity being back here. And I'm, as usual, brief, and I think I'm within my 1 minute. So great. Look forward to seeing people all once again as I get around. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Corder-Peter. Now we'll go over a few VPR policies. These are not policies that are new to any of you, but we do have some updates for some of them. First, with respect to the under recovery program, there is a PPM that has been drafted, has been reviewed and edited by some of our major offices that are involved with the review and or approval. And now it's been submitted to ASD so that it can be routed and reviewed again for Dr. Thomas's signature. The under recovery policy is the policy, you will recall, that speaks to how, whether or not you will be approved as federal PIs to submit to a sponsor that has limited or no indirect cost. In which case, you submit it as you have through the Office of the Sponsor Programs, and they will inform me in most cases, along with Ms. Whitmire, and someone from OGC staff will also be involved in that review. But ultimately, Ms. Whitmire and I will approve or not approve the submission to the sponsor. There are a number of considerations that we have to take into account before we can approve that particular application to a sponsor who does not support full indirects. The next policy I want to share with you was I think released around mid-September of this year. It is the DLAR per diem rates and guidance. These went into effect, I believe, these new rates went into effect October 1. And it's my understanding that the School of Medicine, consequently released some guidance to submit a request for supplemental funding to Ms. Whitmire and Mr. Tinling, but now I think School of Medicine has another process in place. Dr. Kevin Jackson is the point of contact for that particular process. If you're not in the School of Medicine and you are not following that specific guidance that was released, then I encourage you to still follow the guidance that was released around mid-September for additional funds to support your per diem rates. Again, that particular support is provided through fiscal year 21. The next policy I want to speak to is PI eligibility. PI eligibility, the USU Instruction 3200, and some who support us in ASD will be happy to hear this. We are still revising it. The current one is very, very old. And that's one of the first things that I will work with Dr. Corder-Peter on to update this particular policy, the 3200. However, within the 3200, which is the research administration policy, there is something called the PI eligibility. And there is also an opportunity for what we call a PI eligibility waiver. So according to USU Instruction 3200, a person can serve as a PI at the university as long as they are a full-time federal employee. Well, as many of you know, we have many partners in this university. We have very many colleagues who are very interested in applying for funding on their own, and they are not necessarily federal employees. So that particular policy allows for a waiver, if you will, of the USU 3200 policy. The routing for purposes of requesting a PI eligibility waiver have not changed, but more recently, maybe within the last year, maybe two, our Office of General Counsel has become more involved in an effort to protect the university and to protect all of us as federal employees. So they do have some additional requirements as a result. And so my office, the Office of Sponsor Programs, and the Grants Management Specialist team there will reply to you and ask you for the additional information if you've not already provided it in advance. So more to come on PI eligibility, and we again will release some policy. I'm not sure what form it will take, but there will be a policy released. Scientific review. Here, with this bullet, I'm talking about the scientific review that is coordinated by the Office of Research, and within my specific office, Research Administration. We have finally hired a new full-time SRO, that's Scientific Review Officer. Many years ago, maybe 2 years ago now, we had someone who was supporting our office, and he was so great. NIH snatched him up, and I'm sure that's a story that many of us could tell. But now we have Dr. Srinath, Taduru Srinath. Many of you may know him from CPDR. He was formerly there working as a scientist and more recently in an administrative capacity. He has joined our office as the Scientific Review Officer, the lead Scientific Review Officer. And so if you have a program or even a need for an ad hoc review, but if you have any programs that will be releasing funding opportunity announcements in the coming months, please begin to plan with him. Please include him in those conversations as you're preparing your funding announcement. I know many of you may have questions. I'm going to ask you if you don't mind holding them to the end. We want to get through the recording, and I'm going to move on to my next slide. This is a legend. I'm not going to go over it. I wanted you to have it as a part of your packet because my next slide has a lot of alphabet soup, and you all are all feds, so you know that that's the way that we communicate. Okay, this slide I'm going to have to turn and see because my glasses won't allow me to see the details that far. So this slide is a slide I really wanted to be able to provide you all with the different types of applications that are seen in my office. And so the first thing that I want to say is that we have to make it clear, and I know that this is a new way of operating for many of you, and perhaps even most of you, but all applications to sponsors must be reviewed and approved by the OCIO, that's the CIO's office, Mr. Tim Rapp leads that office, and VPR. And in some cases, the Office of General Counsel, OGC, as well as various offices within finance and administration will also review and approve. I'm going to go step by step through this table. And of course, if you have questions, please again, write them in your Q&A function within the Google Meet. First, on the pre-award side, this table is divided into pre-award and post-award. On the pre-award side, the very first row has applications to extramural federal sponsors, extramural sponsors where federal faculty are not eligible to apply. In that case, the administrative review is conducted by the Office of General Counsel, OCIO, and OSP. That's my office, VPR, REA, specifically the Office of Sponsor Programs. The nonprofit partner will submit these applications on behalf of the USU applicant. The scientific review for that particular application is coordinated by the extramural sponsor, and the awards are received directly by the nonprofit partner that submitted it on behalf of the USU application. Acquisitions is not involved in these types of applications or reviews, and the awards are managed by OSP and the nonprofit partner together. The next row, extramural, federal, and eligible. So there are some extramural sponsors that will allow federal employees to apply directly, and in those cases, the Office of General Counsel, the CIO, and OSP will perform the administrative review. The USU applicant PI will submit it to the sponsor. That extramural sponsor will again coordinate scientific review. And this is where the funds are awarded directly to the university. And that BUD is the budget office within finance and administration. Is acquisitions involved? It depends. It depends. It depends on what the requirements are for the budget, and depends on what the science also requires. And so this is why we work together. Our offices work together so we can make some decisions about whether or not acquisitions is involved, and we'll know early enough so that we can engage with them. The award is then managed, if acquisitions is involved, by acquisitions, OSP, and the nonprofit partner. The next row, DoD intramurals. And when I say DoD intramurals, I'm not specifically talking about our USU intramural program. Obviously, it is a DoD intramural, but I'm talking about CDMRPs. I'm talking about funding announcements that say that the applicant must be, funding announcements that are released by the DoD agencies that specifically state that the primary applicant needs to be a DoD person. Once again, I'll ask everyone to please mute your mics. Thank you. In this case, the Office of the CIO, OSP, Finance and Administration, as well as OGC need to be involved. We obviously perform the administrative review, but it's best to involve us early on so that by the time we get to the point, please mute your phone. Thank you. Please mute your mics. Thank you. Oh, 5. Okay, thank you, Mary Kay. Thank you so much, everyone. I didn't even recognize her voice. Thank you. Okay, this is where the USU applicant will submit after receiving site approval, of course, from OSP, and after receiving approval from all of the other offices. The scientific review, it depends. It may be, in the case of CDMRP, it may be reviewed by the folks at MRMC. It's now MRMC. MRMC, yes, thank you. But the awards funds will be received by the budget office. And yes, acquisitions is usually involved in most cases. And again, the award is managed by acquisitions, OSP, and nonprofit partner. And finally, the last type of application that we tend to receive in the Office of Research is a USU intramural. And that could be a funding announcement that came specifically from the VPR office, or it could be a funding announcement that was released by the Health Services Research Program. It could be a funding announcement released by, PAIN, one of our centers, or our cores, other cores or programs. In this case, again, CIO needs to be involved in terms of administrative review. OSP also needs to be involved. And again, the USU applicant submits according to whatever the submission guidelines are that have been released. And this is where our university SRO is involved. And he, in this case, Dr. Srinath, coordinates with the NIH Center for Scientific Review. Budget will handle the funds. Usually the funds are already there. And acquisitions may or may not be involved, as well as they are involved, if so, in the award management along with OSP and our nonprofit partners. I hope that I did not go too fast. I encourage you to please write your questions. I'm happy to answer them. And at this point, I'm going to advance the slide and turn it over to Mr. Tony Martinez to present. Thank you.
Can't hear me. Tony, you're on mute.
Sorry
Tony?
about that. I'm Tony Martinez. I'm from VPR. Hello, everyone. Next slide, please. Okay, as Dr. Randolph covered before, there are different mechanisms for receiving an award and applying for an award. What we're going to discuss here today really revolves around the last 3 rows. And this actually, these last 3 rows actually involve most of the research funding that the university receives. You can see through these mechanisms, the university receives about, in FY20, they received $283 million, whereas only $39 million of our applications and awards were sent directly to a nonprofit partner, like HJF or Geneva or Metis are considered our nonprofit partners. So while I'm talking about pointing out dollar amounts for research, the processes that we're going to discuss today, they can apply to training and education projects as well. Next slide, please. Okay, this is believe it or not, this is a simplified flow chart of the overall process we're going to discuss in today's training. And it covers everything from the pre-award process, which is the PI application and CIO and OSP review up in the upper left of the chart. And post-award, where post-award starts is where funding arrives. That's the box 4, the purple box in the middle left there. And then to the creation of a recipient agreement to a nonprofit partner, potentially. And that's in the lower right of the chart, the blue box, box 14. I don't want to go into all the in and outs of the process. If you have any questions about anything you see on the flow chart, you can just send them directly to me and I'll answer them directly. Next slide, please. Okay, so today's presentation, we're going to cover that process. It's in the flow chart. But we're going to have a number of offices discussing their roles in the process and what they're looking for when they conduct their reviews. So in order after me, the offices that are presenting are the Chief Information Officer, Office of Sponsored Programs, OSP, Financial Management, that includes budget and agreements, the Office, Acquisitions, and then the Office of the General Counsel. And that's it from me. I'm done. I'm ready to turn it over to Sean Baker in the Office of the Chief Information Officer.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Can somebody give me a thumbs up or a wave? Okay, thank you all very much. Clean mic check. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sean Baker. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here for the university. Can we get the next slide, please? So the bottom line from the Office of the CIO is that we have an ongoing responsibility to support you and to support the university by ensuring that all of the IT which supports your research programs, which, let's be honest, is most research anymore because it's kind of hard to do research without data, at least anything you want to put your name on it, but is understanding that the university, our schools, and our centers are all federal entities. And because we're federal entities, that means that we have to follow all of the United States Code and public law, which define the way that IT is to be managed, following the risk management framework. As well, we need to follow DoD issuances supporting the same thing, and oftentimes adding additional rules onto things if we're really honest about it. Now, you're going to hear a lot of stories, and perhaps you've experienced this friction yourself in the past, where you may hear through the rumor mill of the university that a particular program was authorized to do a thing, and you wanted to do that thing, but you contacted our office and we said no. The reality of this situation is that we have some what we're calling grandparented programs around the university who got their start on the research side doing things outside of compliance, but very innocently minded. The CIO's office wasn't involved. We didn't know about it. Our philosophy for these programs is that as new funding is applied, we need to move towards greater security and greater compliance, but we can't start any new research programs outside of the compliance barriers. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a little inconvenient. It's difficult to get into the details. So it's why we always encourage you to reach out and talk to us early as soon as you're thinking about applying for external funding in particular. Now, we have two ways that we can go through the process for CIO review, and that depends on the maturity of your data management plan for the protocol which you seek to execute. If you know everything about your data management plan, you're ready to submit your IRB protocol, you're ready to submit your DSAA, then by all means, we're happy to have sort of a one and done conversation with you where we'll review the whole picture of what you're going to do and say, yes, that's possible. Yes, that's what should happen. And we're ready to go with that, or help you make tweaks if appropriate along the way. But if you're very early in this, someone is giving you a clue that perhaps you should apply for this funding over here, but you only have 24 hours to turn it in. What we can do is do a cursory review of your protocol to say that your data management plan is in the scope of the possible for what the university is allowed to do, that your plans are compatible with DoD regulation. And then after you find out if you've gotten that funding, we can do a more in-depth review of the protocol and how it will execute so that we can be sure to fully support you as we go through. Which one of those is appropriate is very situational. And again, you're always welcome to reach out and try to have a conversation with us about which is the better way of handling that. This is a longitudinal and compliance requirement. So just because we had a conversation and we said yes, doesn't mean that it is a permanent yes to the protocol. If things change, if you're working with a particular university outside the USUS and that partner changes, we need to know about that. Sometimes, particularly if it's outside the continental United States, that throws red flags for who we're collaborating with and who we need to exchange information with, so on and so forth. So it's sometimes these innocuous seeming things which can get in your way. The more conversation we have, the better results we've seen overall. I also want to caution everyone, one thing which we've seen that's not in my office's purview to approve or disapprove are when we're engaging with outside partners. Let's say, for example, that you as a university member are partnering with a military treatment facility and a private institution. And as part of the research protocol, some of the information is meant to go reside at the private institution that's outside of the Department of Defense. Formally, that use needs to be approved under a DoD authority to operate, or ATO document. It's not, in these kind of cases, the university's information. And so it becomes incumbent upon the treatment facility to authorize use of that outside IT. Not a common use case, but what we don't want to do is give you the impression that CIO saying yes means that everything is done and it's going to be smooth sailing. Sometimes we do need to have an ongoing conversation with those outside partners just to make sure that everything is going to go the way you expected it to. That's about everything I had to prepare to talk to you about today, but the last bullet on this slide is the most important one, and that's the email address at which you can reach our team in order to start this engagement process, in order to get you an artifact which allows you to move through and continue to conduct your research. With that, that's everything that I had prepared today, and I'm happy to hand you off to Ms. Sade Randall in OSP. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sade Randall. I am a grants management specialist in the Office of Sponsored Programs. And today I have a few topics that I will review. Next slide, please. Those topics are the intake form update, what do the OSP grants management specialists review, and a NORA. On the next slide, I'm excited to share with you that we have changed the intake form name to the USU Sponsored Programs Approval Request Form. We've also added 2 additional questions. One is the core. Is this approval request for a core program? We've also included a definition, which is a core program is one that is included in the USU's annual appropriation, meaning it is funded across the FYDP through the POM. If you do not know if your program is a core program, please contact the USU FMG to confirm before submitting this form. We've also added the question, has your proposal been reviewed by the Office of the Chief Information Officer? If yes, the OSP specialist asks that you upload your OCIO approval in the folder that is shared with you. If the answer is no, please email Tech for Research to work with the OCIO team member for project approval. Next slide, please. What do the OSP specialists review? We provide pre and post-award administrative support to our faculty and students. On the next slide, we have provided you with the REA OSP staff. Mrs. Kaisha Drake, Sharday Randall, Ms. Janine Paschal, and Mrs. Prince are your OSP specialists. We've also included a list of departments for each grants management specialist. Should you have any questions, comments, or concerns, there is our point of contact information, as well as our office hours. On the next slide, I apologize in advance if you're not able to see it. Due to the sizing of the flow chart, it was hard to make it visible. However, this slide will be provided with your materials. And I want to point out a few key notes here. The OSP timeline for the pre-award process is as follows. A submitted USU sponsored programs request approval form takes approximately 2 business days to receive a project shared folder. Full proposal review with no errors takes 3 to 4 business days from OSP specialist review to the OSP directorate review and approval. Proposal reviews with errors takes approximately 3 to 7 business days, depending upon when the PI or program manager corrects the errors. Under recovery approval takes approximately 2 business days, and PI eligibility waiver approval takes a minimum of 2 to 3 weeks. On this flow chart, as you can see in the first swim lane, it starts with the principal investigator. The PI will identify a funding opportunity announcement. Now, many of you work with your department program managers. However, we want you to know that OSP is also here to provide assistance if needed. Once you have submitted your USU sponsored programs approval request form, the OSP specialist will review the form. If there are no errors, we will send you the project shared folder. The project shared folder is there for you to upload all of your sponsor and VPR required documents. A few of those required documents are the signed USU Form 3208, a detailed research proposal or SOW, a detailed budget and budget justification, a CV or biosketch for all PIs and key personnel, a letter of support or letter of collaboration, if applicable, the sponsored required documents, and the sponsor guidelines or instructions, if applicable. Once the OSP specialist has received those documents, we will conduct a detailed review. That review consists of checking for incompleteness, inaccuracies, or omissions, that it complies with the sponsor guidelines and USU policies. You have used the correct indirect cost rates and support cost recovery rates. The budget calculations and items are accurate. The budget justification is sufficient in detail, and it matches what the budget has. And we've also checked the USU Form 3208. If there are no required revisions, we will forward those documents to the OSP Directorate for review and approval. The OSP Directorate reviews the USU connection and military relevance, the project narrative and/or SOW to ensure that it's in line with the sponsor's mission, the PI qualifications and support, the budget justification and regulatory oversight, as well as the assurances. If there are no required revisions, the OSP Directorate will sign your US Form 3208. Once the form has been signed, we will email you a link to the form, and that is your approval to submit to the sponsor. That completes the OSP pre-award process. Next slide, please. The NOR. The questions we get asked often, what is the NOR? The NOR is a Notice of Research Approval. It is confirmation that a project is research or non-research, military relevant, and would be funded in accordance with the Financial Management Regulation FMR. The NORA is processed in the award stage, meaning once the funding arrives at the university. The NORA only includes funding administered by USU. Next slide, please. On this slide, as I mentioned before, I apologize if it's too small to see, but I do want to point out a few key details. NORAs are processed after verifying the budget matches the funding amount received, the PI has not changed, and we have all the updated documents pertaining to the award received. On the second row, the process actually starts with the OSP grant specialist. The OSP grant specialist will review the funding document received in the budget office and compare it with the actual project that was submitted, the proposal. If the funding received matches what was proposed, then we will upload your link to the 3208, your budget and budget justification, your SOW, and we will upload that into the NORA link in the DPR site database. Majority of the times, the funding that was proposed does not match what was actually received. So in that case, we will actually have you fill out a new USU sponsored programs approval request form. Again, you will get that form, you will submit that form, and we will send you a project shared folder. The documents that are required in this case, in the post-award stage, are the updated budget and budget justification that matches what the amount that was received from the sponsor, an updated SOW, and a USU Form 3208. Now, many of you ask, when is a 3208 required? I do want to point out that a 3208 is not always required. However, here are a list of when it is required. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Minutes left.
Okay. A change or addition to the scope of statement of work, a PI change or PI transfer, a grant transfer, a project title change, a change in the budget amount, personnel has been added or taken away, funding for additional personnel and additional equipment, and when the performance sites has changed. Once we've received all your documents, we will do another review. Just as the pre-award process, we will review for the same things. The OSP directorate will review and sign your 3208. We will send you the link to that USU Form 3208, as well as upload the 3208, the budget justification, and SOW in the NOR. And that completes the OSP process and is moved on to the budget office. Mr. Andy Gwinnett will, yes, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Andy Gwinnett. I hope everybody can hear me just fine. All right. Thanks, Sean. Okay, next slide, please. So once the NORA shows up in the budget office, we're going to go back and we're going to double check some stuff that's already been checked, but just to make sure. The key is that the NORA and the USU budget that we receive match. If FCC and indirects are charged correctly, we'll double check all that. The way to make sure that all of this happens, honestly, is that you start with the most updated budget template. And you start it at the Start Here tab. So that'll be the best thing you can do to speed this process along and help yourself get your money quickly. Let's see here. We're going to make sure that the funding is appropriate for research, whether you're using RDT&E or O&M funds. We'll make sure that that's the right appropriation. We're going to look at the budget template and the budget justification and make sure that all of that ties back to the SOW, the statement of work. And we need to see a separate budget justification for funds being executed at USU and the funds being executed by the nonprofit. So we'll double check all of that for you and make sure everything lines up appropriately. So once everything does line up appropriately, we'll issue the NOBA, the Notice of Budget Approval, and we'll load the funds in GFIBs for you. We'll go ahead and build you a WBS, and let you know what that is in GFIPS and where your money's located. We'll send a notification to RMI office, and they will enter the PR for you if you need a PR and a cooperative agreement. And then the RMI office will notify either the PI that your PR is entered, and will attach a copy of your NOBA. So that's pretty simple process there in the budget office. Okay, next chart. The agreements office also works for me, and as you're probably well aware, you're going to need an agreement anytime we're working with an external agency and exchanging money or personnel or proprietary information. The principal investigators or your staff should complete the online agreements request form, and you can find that on the home page under agreements. By going through the A to Z tab. Oftentimes we will get emails from the external agencies to begin an agreement. So we don't really take those emails or do anything with them. We reach out and try to find the PI that's associated with that external agency and that agreement, so that you can start the internal process at USU. We'll see what type of agreement. We'll go ahead and help you figure out what that is as you're going through the form. If you don't know whether you need an MOU, an MOA, an IAA, the agreement specialist will help you out, and we'll go ahead and assign that to a specialist that's very experienced in doing these agreements for you. The type that we have that the USU office, the agreements office, manages are memorandums of understanding. Typically, or not typically, there is no money involved with a memorandum of understanding. There are memorandums of agreement that could have money or maybe not, and interagency agreements, which you'll often hear referred to as a 7600A and B. Then there are agreements that are managed by the JOT office, and those would be data use agreements, material transfer agreements, cooperative research and development agreements, or CRADAs. And if we get some of those in, or if you contact us and that's the kind of agreement you need, we'll redirect you to the JOT office. So timelines, because everybody's always in a rush for these, and I understand completely why you are. A narrative agreement could take 4 months or longer, could be quicker, but typically it's going to be 4 months. And that's usually not based on USU actions and staffing. It's based on the external agency. So if you're working with an external agency and we can't get out of them a response, we may come back to you and ask you to help us with the external agency you're trying to get an agreement with. Next chart, please. The funding agreements is what we mostly do. Those are called interagency agreements. It has two parts. There's the 7600A, that's the actual agreement, has your general terms and conditions on there. It'll be, we like to do those for 5-year time frame if your research will go on that long. If not, then obviously we'll do shorter. But we'd like to do it for a 5-year time frame. The dollar amount that's on the 7600A is actually to cover the entire 5-year project, so that we can then, the A in that case is done, and then all we have to do is add the funding documents to the A every year after that. The funding documents can be multiple types. 7600B goes along with an A, but you could have an A and no B, and you could have a MIPR. If the external agency that we're working with is also in GFIBS, the Army system, so if it's an Army agency, we'll probably do a direct charge through GFIBS for those guys. Let's see here. To do an IAA, we're going to ask you for the same stuff we've probably already got, but just in case, you might hear from us the statement of work, the budget justification, and the budget. If for some reason we can't find it, we may have to reach out to you. There are some external agencies that we've dealt with that like to have a memorandum of agreement in addition to the 7600A that is really an agreement also. The memorandum of agreement, they prefer those sometimes to be added to it just because it adds additional clarity and a lot more data than what you can put in a 7600A. So a funding agreement, the 7600A, will typically take no more than a month, 1 to 4 weeks. Again, providing that everybody's responsive, and typically it's on the other side where our staff is pretty responsive in getting the reviews back to us pretty quickly. I missed the red note in the top. It's in the red, so I wouldn't miss it. IAA is not a multi-party agreement. It's just between us and one external agency, just so you know. Next chart. That's all I have. Looking forward to questions at the end, and I turn it over to Ms. Victoria Cunningham.
Thanks, Andy. Good afternoon. My name is Victoria Cunningham. I serve as the Deputy Director of Acquisitions, and I'm going to speak with you today about a few changes to the Code of Federal Regulations, specifically to CFR 200, which affects grants and cooperative agreements. I'm also going to be discussing with you FY20 lessons learned, which I hope will be helpful as you prepare for your FY21 documentation. Next slide, please. So first, let's just dive into the regulatory changes that are coming down the pike to grants and cooperative agreements. So for situational awareness, this is the first major overhaul of the regulations in the last 5 or 6 years. And while the regulations have been changed to encompass and reflect a whole host of updates, from standardization of data and reporting to actual implementation of statutory requirements, the most significant change is the one that affects you as PIs, which is how to describe the work conducted under federal assistance awards. So the significant change that I'd like to specifically point out is that there is now a requirement to document performance goals for your project or your program. And so to take that one step further, not only are you documenting the goals, but you're also required to actually include a plan to assess the performance under that award. Now, it's important to remember that these changes don't go into effect until mid-November. And so ACQ is looking forward to receiving implementation guidance so that we can work directly with you as you prepare your FY21 documentation. But in the interim, I think there are a couple of key important questions for you to be mindful of and thinking about as you're doing your project and program planning. So for instance, as you're working on your project or program plan, you're going to want to keep in mind, what are my actual performance goals and objectives for my project or program? Are there any indicators or performance targets that I can establish for this work? If you find that there are some things that you can identify up front, you're going to want to document those in all of your narrative explanation of your project and program. The second piece is that you're going to want to think about, how can I, looking at these project goals and objectives, how can I assess the performance of this work against these goals? Are there maybe specific metrics that you can be using that you can start to outline? Those are the things that are going to be essential for us as we go forward. These questions that I've asked or posed for thought, these are things that we are going to need to document in your award. So again, while unfortunately we don't yet have specific templates or implementation guidance to give you, what I can say is that ACQ is monitoring these requirements through working groups and through other means, working with our policy office. And so as we receive more information closer to mid or late November, we will be disseminating that to help you with the formulation of your FY21 requirements. So that all being said, I think some of the changes to the manner in which you write your project or program, or write about your project or program, kind of leads into my first lesson learned of FY20. So I feel like over the last year or so, there's been a lot of discussion, and I dare say confusion, around some of the terminology related to statement of work or statement of objectives. And so what I wanted to do, to be clear, is statement of work and statement of objectives, those phrases are typically phrases that you'd see in relation to procurement contracts. So I wanted to take a moment today to kind of course correct some of the terminology and hopefully make this a little bit easier for folks to digest. So when you're working on a write-up, and that write-up is for a grant or cooperative agreement, what you're ultimately providing is something called a project narrative. And that narrative serves as a detailed description of your proposed project or your program activities. It's going to include such things as your objectives for your project or program. It's going to include your implementation plan associated with that work. It's going to talk about the goals that will be accomplished. But there's also a number of other things that you're going to include, some of which I think you all are already doing today. So for instance, you're going to include things like a relevant background piece or statement associated with your project to give your project or program some context. With that, you're going to include your public purpose, which again, I think we've been working toward over the last year to incorporate more frequently. You're going to want to identify things like deliverables or any particular milestone meetings, reports, or data that you expect to receive during the course of the project or program activity under the award. Likewise, you're going to want to make sure that you have a schedule or some sort of milestone plan identifying key milestones associated with your project. And then lastly, as mentioned before, which this is relatively new, again, you're going to want to be thinking about those metrics or a measurement plan. How are you going to evaluate the success of your project and the outcomes of your project? So in addition to those things, one of the areas that I think we definitely need to work on in FY21 is also ensuring that you're clearly delineating in your project narrative the tasks and the areas that each party is responsible for. So for instance, you're going to want to delineate the tasks or the work that USU will be responsible for completing versus the tasks or the work areas that the recipient is going to be responsible for completing. Additionally, I think some of you may find yourselves in a situation where there are sub-recipients. And so you're going to want to make sure to also highlight what they are responsible for as well. I think some of the questions and some of the clarifications that ACQ often spends time on is trying to discern when looking at a project narrative and looking at your supporting documents, who is doing what and at what point. So that being said, the second lesson learned that you'll see on the screen that I'd like to touch upon today is ensuring that you have consistent data and information across all of your documentation. So historically, what I can tell you is that our office has spent a great deal of time going back and forth on questions, largely due to inconsistencies across your documentation. So to take a moment to just give you a couple of examples. So you have three main documents. You have your project narrative, formerly your statement of work or statement of objectives. You have your budget, and you have your budget justification. All three of these documents should be aligning and tracking to one another. So your project narrative should support the budget categories that you've listed in your budget, and your budget justification should align with those budget categories and properly support the budget categories proposed. So as an example to illustrate, let's say you're proposing a project and that narrative has a large component of laboratory-based work. You're going to need materials to conduct that work, materials and supplies. So your project narrative should be highlighting the work that's being performed and the types of things that would be needed in the conduct of the tasks and work areas. Your materials should be a budget category that's in your budget document. And your budget justification should explain the types of materials that are anticipated and provide supporting details concerning those material costs. The materials then proposed in both the type and the amount would be sufficiently supported across all three documents to determine as a grants officer that they're reasonable and can be supported based on the narrative provided. I would also like to just pull that thread a little bit further and mention, while we're on the topic of supporting documentation, that it's important that you have the required level of detail to support the cost categories that you're actually proposing. In acquisitions, we often spend a great deal of time trying to obtain that supporting documentation. So supporting the details of the costs or the robust justifications of why something is needed. So it's important to explain upfront what is being purchased or what is needed, and then providing, sufficient detail to explain how you arrived at that. So some of you may have a similar project that's been undertaken in prior years. And so historically, using that, project as an example, you might have incurred $7,500 of materials on average per budget year. So all we need to understand is that basis of your estimate, understanding those details that you're going back to a prior project. This is your historical spend based on a similar or comparable project. And again, providing that justification upfront in the documentation. This is going to save an immense amount of review time in our office. And so ultimately, hopefully, will speed along your cooperative agreement or grant. The third thing I'd like to touch upon that you'll see on the screen is that it's important to present a realistic, reasonable approach, towards your budget and realistic and supportable timeframes for completing your project or program. So let's talk a little bit about the realistic and supportable budget first. So when you're planning your program, and then by virtue planning your budget, you're thinking about key questions such as what costs are required? Who is actually incurring those costs? Is it the recipient? Is it the subrecipient? When are the costs going to be incurred? In what budget year? Will it span multiple budget years? Are these costs recurring costs every year? Those are some of the questions that you'll want to ask. And then in your budget narrative or budget justification, you're going to want to, again, justify those costs. That all said, in terms of realistic and supportable timeframes, it's important to think about how long it will actually take to accomplish your project or program objectives. And so as you're setting forth in your program planning, you're going to want to be thinking and making sure that your timeline truly does account for all of your necessary requirements. Things like IRB approvals or patient recruitment. So that way, when you finalize your documentation, if you think accomplishing these goals will truly take about 24 months or 2 years, then you can confidently say in your documentation, this is a 2-year project. I'm going to have 2 budget years. Here are my costs, and we can drill down, accordingly. I think one of the things that you'll remember when I first started this presentation, as I mentioned, the new regulations and, requirements. And I think the important takeaway is that, these new regulations are directly resulting in increased requirements in terms of performance monitoring. So when we're thinking about performance monitoring, in addition to looking at the metrics that you're establishing and potentially a measurement plan that you've established at the outset, it's important to also remember that you can monitor your award through looking at the technical progress that's being accomplished to date, as well as monitoring your expenditures. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about technical progress monitoring. So you all should be receiving progress reports throughout the course of a year or a budget cycle. If you're not receiving those reports, what I'd ask is that you reach out to our grants officers in our office so that we can correct that, because something's amiss. But generally speaking, you should be receiving those technical progress reports. And when they're being received, the things that, I think there are a couple of key things to remember. I think the first thing is to truly review those reports and look at what the status of your project is. So you might find that your project is ahead of the schedule that you anticipated, but you also might find that the project could be lagging, or in some way it's been delayed or falling behind. And so that may require some sort of corrective action plan on the technical end of your project. But it could also lead to, actual actions on your grant award or cooperative agreement award with our office. which is why it's important that when you review those technical progress reports, that you are engaging with our office on your project status. Because it may be that you need to, based on what you're seeing in those reports, perhaps rebudget or potentially modify your project or program goals. And so our office can help you with those things. The earlier you get in to speak with us, to talk with us about that status, the better off you'll be in the long run. But again, there could also be circumstances where maybe a rebudget isn't necessarily needed, but perhaps a conversation with the recipient is needed about the recipient's performance. Let's say USU's tasks are going quite well. Let's say that the subrecipient's tasks are going quite well, but the recipient themselves, maybe some of their task areas are just not to the level of performance or expectation that you had anticipated. So please engage with our grants officers early on so that we can facilitate a discussion with the recipient to try to course correct any challenges that you're experiencing. So that all being said, let's talk a little bit about monitoring expenditures. And this is very similar to your monitoring of the technical progress, but you're using some different tools and asking some slightly different questions. So as you're getting, expenditure reports or you're seeing invoices, the thing to remember is you're looking at how much funding is actually remaining on your project. And you're looking to see, is that the amount of funding that I would have expected to expend if, when I originally programmed planned? So based on where I'm at in terms of my milestones and accomplishments, have I expended about what I expected to expend under this award? Because you might find yourself, as we, I think, often do, where you might be underrunning a bit. And so the result of that is that you may need a no-cost extension. And so engaging with our office early on when you think you might need those no-cost extensions, if you're monitoring those technical progress reports and you're looking at things, every month or every quarter, you're going to hopefully see early on, I really do need, in the second quarter, I need that no cost extension. Let me ask proactively, let me talk with ACQ. So you're going to want to engage with us earlier in that process. What is not a great solution in terms of engaging with our office would be, for instance, waiting until the last month of your project to determine that you need a no-cost extension, or in some cases that I saw last year, the last day of your project. So our goal is to ensure that you don't experience any sort of lapse or gap in your requirement. And so waiting until the last day is that's really just too late, quite frankly. So again, engaging with us early in terms of those no-cost extensions is critical. The other piece to the funding is, of course, a lot of times folks receive additional funding for their projects, which is fantastic because obviously that furthers the science and the research goals. But what I would ask is that you work with us up front in terms of funding, providing additional funding to your requirement. We want to make sure in ACQ that we're putting on the funding at the right time, and that funding has, the appropriate work or tasks associated with it. So again, if you find yourself in a situation where you're getting additional funding, please reach out to us as soon as you're aware of it so that we can work with you closely on that. The last piece that I'd really like to mention kind of takes me back to the beginning of where this presentation started. As we see these increased regulations and requirements, it's, I think, important for us to remember that comes with it an increased responsibility for monitoring projects and programs in some of the ways that we've just talked about. And so that monitoring piece, I can't...
Victoria, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you.
You have 2 minutes left.
That monitoring piece is absolutely critical. We're seeing already an increase in data calls and reporting requirements associated with grants and cooperative agreements, and I anticipate that this is going to continue. Things like obligations, remaining funds, disbursements, those are just some of the areas that are being critically monitored that I've recently had to report on. So the monitoring that I'm asking you all to do is really critical to these efforts in order for USU to ensure that it's meeting its requirements and remaining in compliance with the regulations and our evolving policies. What I'd like to do is just close and say, you know, we in ACQ recognize the importance and the criticality of your work. And so for FY21, what I'd really love to see is just more collaboration between the PI community and our office. So please just don't hesitate to reach out to us, to our team of grants officers. We're here to do everything we can to position you and your projects and programs for success. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Stanton from OGC.
Thank you, Victoria. Welcome, PIs, and thank you for the opportunity to support my colleagues today. I am one of 4 full-time attorneys in the Office of General Counsel. I primarily advise on agreements, contracts, fiscal law, tech transfer, and ethics. I have never served as a budget officer or a contracting officer or a privacy officer or an IT specialist, so what I do is do the legal research when requirements come out and those clients have specific questions or they want me to review an agreement for legality or things of that nature. So all of the information or counsel to you as PIs from OGC should be entirely consistent with what you're hearing from all of the speakers before me, and therefore there shouldn't be any OGC surprises. With that said, there are different policy, regulatory, and legal requirements that some of the other offices may not have been thinking of when they were conducting their reviews. And so what that might mean is that your SOW, or your statement of objective, or your project narrative, whatever you choose to call it, it might have scientific integrity, and it might receive the full support of VPR. But when I look at the SOW through my lens, I may find that it's insufficient to merely be cut and pasted into some other agreement for which it's intended. And so to avoid any surprises, USU is going to be issuing USU Instruction 7044, which is about USU's use of its agreement authorities. And it hasn't been issued yet, but it's pending very soon, and I think that it will help you to better understand how OGC views the agreements through its lens so that there aren't surprises. I'll give you one quick example. Conferences. You may state in your project narrative that you'll be conducting a conference, and that's fine. It has research integrity. It's fine. The budget looks okay, but it also has other layers of approval to go through and must be reviewed by our conference chair as well. So just because something has received a sign off at one particular office doesn't mean that it's all the way through the gates. So just to talk a little bit more before I move into my next slide about the pending instruction. This instruction is going to list all of the types of agreements into which USU can enter. It's going to list the responsibilities of the various USU offices. It's going to list considerations that should be made for the selection of sources, meaning which nonprofit partner might be the best for a particular project or which federal partner might be the best. It's going to explain what is considered a personal expense versus a business expense. It has some quick information about how appropriations from the defense health programs flow to USU. It has an attachment on factors to be used when you're selecting the proper instrument for an agreement with a non-federal entity. It talks a little bit about the use of the Economy Act when you're entering into agreements with other government entities. It talks about conference training fee collection and other fiscal law principles. Generally, there are 3 policies that I'll talk about today that this new instruction will support. It is intended to support the highest quality project narratives or statement of works or statement of objectives, whatever you may call them, to the greatest possible value to the government. So many of our PIs have said, but this is the way I've always been doing it, and perhaps that's the way you always will be doing it, but this instruction will help ensure that you're considering the factors and reviewing and looking at all of the potential partners that you could be working with and mechanisms in which you could be using to be sure that you are doing things as well and as efficiently and as effectively as you can be. In ensuring the highest quality value, the USU employees are going to be directed by our USU president to use best efforts to identify more than one potential collaborator for a cooperative enterprise in medical research, education, and consultation. That doesn't mean that you'll have to switch the collaborator that you've been using for all these years, but it helps to show and document that we've objectively selected the best collaborator based on the strengths of those individual potential collaborators and those factors that are articulated in our instruction. And finally, this policy will talk about the types of affiliations and obligations and funding that we will accept to further our educational mission and promote our defense laboratory research objectives. And I'll share how we accept those and when we might determine that it's not appropriate for USU to accept those, and while we will be participants in that research, that we may not necessarily be the administrators of such research. So I don't want to bore you with a longer laundry list of all the issues that have come up. So what I decided to do, next slide please, is to highlight the things that are going well from OGC's perspective and things that can be improved. In terms of what's going well, we already have this year begun to focus our project merit narratives more on results. We're paying more attention to data and the ownership and custodian and access of that data, and being explicit in our agreements about what our intent is, why we want this, and what that means for us and what we're going to be able to do in the future. There are times when issues arise despite our best efforts to work well with one another, and we need to be able to look at these project narratives, and we need to be able to state the nonprofit partner was responsible for this de-identification effort, not USU, and as such, this is what we need to do going forward. When we have project narratives that are not clear about the roles, which Victoria talked about before me, then we run into situations where we're all pointing at each other and we have a mess to resolve. So we need to be able to hold our partners accountable, and our partners need to be able to hold us accountable for what we promised our role would be. So what I implore you to do, while we're doing great things, and I know we're going to be doing even better in this coming year, please do not just be pasting your center's strategic plan as your project narrative. When you're focusing on results, you should be considering objectives. That might be filing invention disclosure. It might be filing a certain number of publications for the public good. It might be presenting at a certain number of conferences. It's I know, easier to just state the tasks of what you're going to do under something, and it's a harder challenge to really state those goals and our ambitious goals to which USU wants to be standing by. Secondly, what you're doing well is ethics involvement. I'll tell you, we are so busy in the ethics office. It's a revolving door every day. So I thank you for coming into ethics office. Each time that you have a research, speaking engagement, a writing opportunity, you need to be thinking about which hat you're wearing. Is this in your official capacity, or is this outside of your USU function? And if it's outside of your USU duties, come to my office, to our ethics office, so that you can get that approved outside activity request. I'll tell you, if it's in a USU statement of work, if it has a VPR site approval, then it's not an outside activity request. So you can again come to my office and find out what the parameters are of that work if you have questions. So thank you for filing. For those of you that are 278 filers and 450 filers, you're already getting these ethics briefings over the last month, and we still have slots. Continue to file, because we know that there are lots of opportunities to collaborate with brilliant people, but when those brilliant people happen to be your business partners or your family members, we really need to be cautious and be exploring how best to create that opportunity for USU while making sure that everybody is in line and following our ethical parameters. Recently, NIH promulgated guidance that no longer permits non-HHS federal employees to participate on NIH peer review panels. And that includes participation in the initial review groups, special emphasis panels, scientific review groups, site visits, things of that nature. So we've already been getting a myriad of outside activity requests, and we will be analyzing those. And we really encourage the department chairs, the center directors, to be looking to make sure that when you're approving that outside activity, that isn't going to close doors for USU and prohibit us from being able to perhaps reach out to a partner we would have wanted to reach out to who had submitted a grant proposal, and now that PI is precluded from partnering with that person because they had that opportunity. And then finally, what USU is doing well, I noticed throughout just this presentation today how we have this tone, which some of you may not even realize is something to be truly proud of, and that is how flexible USU is. When it comes to our support agreements office, when it comes to our Joint Office of Tech Transfer, we are proud to be able to say, all right, MTF, if you need an agreement to look this way, if you need a SAO for this IAA, if you need it to be a CRADA instead, we'll find a nonprofit partner. We'll do what we need to do to get this research started or this educational project started. So you will not find USU saying it must be this way, it can't be that way, because we're very flexible in our relationships. Next slide, please. That brings me to what we can do better. If your project has a public purpose, state that in the project narrative. And if it doesn't have a public purpose, don't try to make one up. I, as the attorney, review the Government Accountability Office opinions and the guidance, and I know kind of what our parameters are for using the instruments inappropriately. And so we rely on you, and the acquisitions office relies on you as the PI to really explain what you're doing and whether it has a public purpose so that they know which instrument to be using. Medical research, yes, we can always, we have never seen a situation where we can't articulate a public purpose because you're stating that you're going to be disseminating these publicly. It could be utilized for other individuals in the public, but make sure you state that up front. What else we could be doing better is using these measurements so that our nonprofit partner knows what to expect of them. How many publications do you expect? What might our collaborator do that would cause you to be disappointed in them? You're not going to write that in your project narrative, but be thinking about that as you draft it so that you can be articulated and everybody's clear what the expectations are. The third one, let's please focus on USU's mission, and not all DoD medical research is necessarily within USU's mission. So please remember that USU can participate in the collaboration without having to be the entity that administers all the funding to different MTFs. Because our contracting officers and our grants officers are already swamped. So we can, in some situations, particularly those when we're not getting the core funding, we can still get the glory without doing all these administrations. So be thinking and be mindful of what might be best and in USU's best interests. And critically, I can't say this enough because I see this all too often in my 2 years that I've been at USU, where our PIs are signing documents on behalf of the institution, and you shouldn't be. So if you see an NIH researcher collaborator agreement and it just looks like a standard thing and your buddy next door signed one, so you clearly think you should sign one, don't sign anything. If you're asked to sign things, please come to OGC in advance and say, hey, do I have the authority to sign this? The good news is we have been updating some USU instructions, so things like agreements with publishers to publish our official works. We have that authority delegated down as long as OGC reviews the agreement and sees that there isn't anything legally prohibited. That'll be easy. It's not going to take you a long time to get those signed. But please don't sign you may sign the data sharing agreement applications, but when it comes down to the agreement itself, you are not USU, you're not the institution. You don't want to do that to yourself because you want to be doing things within the scope of your employment. So if issues arise, you can avail yourself of USU's counsel and not be operating outside of that. So please don't sign committing money, committing things, unless you know for sure that you have a warrant to be able to do those things. And then final piece, if you want to be funding development and FDA approvals and things that go beyond our advanced research and our translational research, please make sure that you are putting those in your budget justifications. You're telling our USU Finance in advance so that our appropriations specifically direct USU to do that, because our DoD instruction that gives USU its mission is quite narrow with respect to all of those development areas, with the exception of AFRI. And so I encourage you to ask in advance and be sure that our funding states exactly what you want to be doing with that funding so that we're in the green. So I'll just add one final point. My colleague, our Deputy General Counsel, Sam Smith, he reviews the conference approval requests along with Sylvia Scher, and he wanted to make sure that you're aware that the USU president is approving USU conferences, and those expenditures have to follow law and policy, and there are special rules for those conferences, and so things that have been done in the past are being done a little bit differently now, and you're being asked for more details now. So if you are one of those PIs that also has conferences, please make sure that you're asking questions and sharing information early so that you don't encounter any surprises. So with that, thank you so much for your time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Randolph for more information about PI training. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stanton. Before Ms. Whitmire comes back up, I'd like to just turn your attention, as if today wasn't enough PI training. We do have additional trainings planned for you in the coming months. There are several listed here. Please plan to attend as you see the announcements come out. We will, I know those of you on the phone are federal employees, federal faculty, federal staff, federal administrators. We will have a training for our contract partners and for others who weren't able to attend this. It will be likely open to all in that case. And some of the information may be a bit different. So we did want you to be able to mark your calendars. You will receive email invitations or at least announcements to the future trainings that are here, and all of you have your slides, so you'll be able to plan accordingly. Thank you again for your attention. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Whitmire. I hope that you all have enjoyed the PI training, and I hope that we'll have a very fruitful Q&A discussion. Thank you. Ms. Whitmire.
Thank you so much, Dr. Randolph.